Charlie Kirk debated Hasan Piker at Politicon 2018, and Kirk's performance was nothing short of a right-wing talking point extravaganza. He made faulty arguments on subjects like corruption, socialism, government programs, and the effect of democratic policies. Here we're going to take a close look at his arguments, and I'll explain the many things that are wrong with them. During one exchange, Kirk claimed that some of the worst-run cities in America are democratic, and that is the product of their policies.
Let's bring it back domestically then. Why is it the most murderous, hopeless, and poor cities in America are all run by Democrats?
What? What does that have to do with anything? Yeah, okay, yeah, they're bad. What do you want me to say? Okay, sure.
Well, because your very policies are put on trial in Philadelphia and Chicago and Oakland
like Rahm Emanuel,
and Portland,
the big socialist
Seattle,
who said
Milwaukee.
Chicago needed socialized medicine and that's why there's gun violence. Chicago's
already entertaining universal basic income, of which you support. They're entertaining
so you're saying they premeditatedly are having a lot of violence because they're going to implement universal basic income?
Well, they also have the strictest gun laws in the country,
please,
but
one time.
you're a big fan of those too.
Please make a good argument one time.
No,
Can
you answer the question though? Why is it that the most murderous...
Some of those Democrats are bad. What do you want me to say?
Well, maybe the ideas are bad, Hasan, and maybe the ideas don't work.
First thing is first. Nice ugly-ass sneakers, dude. Those look like the kind of things that an out-of-shape dad would wear at his son's soccer game or something. Might as well put on some dirty gray sweatpants to go with them while you're at it. Why don't you do us all a favor and take those sneakers back to whatever dumpster you fished them out of and throw them back in there? Alright, so this argument about some of the worst-run cities being democratic is one that I also heard Fox News recently make. Their source for this claim was a Wallet Hub study which found that 8 of the 10 worst-run cities are democratic. Here is the other crucial side of the equation that is completely left out by Kirk and Fox News and every other conservative who makes this argument. The majority of the best-run cities are also democratic. 6 of the top 10, according to that same study. And this is no surprise when you consider that cities generally tend to be democratic, oftentimes even within deep red states. So if we're going to blame democratic policies for the condition of these worst-run cities, shouldn't we logically also be crediting democratic policies for how good these best-run cities are doing? To only look at one side of this equation is extremely dishonest. And here, perhaps I'm just being kind of nitpicky, but Kirk claimed that all of the worst-run cities in America are run by Democrats. This is just factually incorrect, as there are clearly examples of terribly run cities with Republicans in charge. It's also important to point out that present-day political leadership isn't necessarily responsible for the abject state of these cities. Many other factors could also play a role. Maybe within cities generally, there tend to be high rates of crime and poverty, with this perhaps having to do with the high cost of living, unemployment rates, close proximity of people, and so forth. I can tell you that if I had to ride the subway every single day and I was surrounded by people wearing ugly-ass Charlie Kirk shoes, I'd probably turn to a life of crime as well. And by that, I mean I'd rob them of their shoes and throw them into a bottomless pit. I would just do things the old-fashioned way where you kick their ass and hang their shoes from a power line, if not for the fact that they're such a goddamn eyesore. I wouldn't want to pollute my already depraved enough democratic city with such filth. You also need to look at the history of these cities' political landscape. What if some of them had Republican rule for decades and only recently switched to Democratic? What if the shitty conditions of those cities was largely brought about by the Republican policies, and the people got so fed up that they voted Democrat as a corrective to try to alleviate those problems? I would also question how much of an impact citywide policies even have. What if in certain areas it's the statewide, or even the federal policies that are predominantly influential? What if a blue city in a red state is doing poorly, but if you actually did a close analysis, you'd find that the blue city is suffering because of the statewide Republican policies? Just to give one potential example, imagine a red state that declined the Medicaid expansion under Obamacare. Perhaps the inability or difficulty in paying one's medical bills as a result of this pushes more people in blue cities into a life of crime. And it's not like a city can just do whatever the fuck it wants in every single area. City policy is often restricted by state and federal guidelines. Can a city just out of the blue, quite literally, adopt a single-payer healthcare system? I don't think it works that way. And individual cities may not even have the funding to do some of the things they want to do because of the complex nature of raising and allocating government funds across the country. Kirk claims that the policies and the ideas are to blame, but things are clearly much more complicated than he leads us to believe. And if you look at how red states compare to blue states, you see that in many key areas, red states underperform. And this is important because I would argue that in many areas, statewide policies are more influential than citywide policies. Although yes, many of my points about confounding variables and so forth would also apply here. I'm not going to go super in-depth on this point, although it's something I might address in more detail in a future project, but I'll just give 2 quick examples on education and crime. As we read on politicsthatwork.com, quote, the top 15 states with the largest percentage of the population having bachelor's degrees are blue. Massachusetts tops the list with 38% of its population having a bachelor's degree. The partisan gap is even more dramatic with regard to postgraduate degrees. For example, a master's degree, PhD, law degree, medical degree, MBA, etc. The 16 states in which the largest percentage of the population had graduate degrees are all blue, end quote. And as a Smart Politics analysis reveals, quote, a Smart Politics analysis of partisan control of state legislatures finds the 27 states with Democratic-controlled legislatures with an average violent crime rate of 390 incidents per 100,000 residents. The average violent crime rate for the 14 states with Republican-controlled legislatures was 11.1% higher, at 433 incidents per 100,000 residents. For Democratic-controlled states, the property crime rate was 3,044 incidents per 100,000 residents, compared to 3,351 incidents per 100,000 residents for Republican-controlled states, or a 10.1% higher rate under GOP legislative control, end quote. There was a comment on this article written by user Being Good, which says the following, quote, it is clear to me that the red states have citizens that take personal initiative and self-reliance very seriously. They have a criminal element that is not afraid to go to work. As such, they pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get her done, end quote. That is some funny shit right there. So not only is Kirk's argument one-sided and deceptive, not only does a full examination of the data actually undermine his position, but Kirk fails to take into consideration the complex reality of which levels of policy are responsible for the condition of a city. And if you run statewide comparisons, you see that blue states do better in several key areas. Hasan definitely could have done a better job of pushing back against this point, but of course it's always easy to Monday morning quarterback. And with that said, Hasan did make a great point when he was like, oh, so they're premeditatively turning to violence in Chicago because they're considering implementing UBI? Ah, yes, the scourge of psychic, politically motivated criminals. I might just try to make a shitty TV show out of that or something. Another silly argument that Kirk made was about the inefficiency of government.
Can you show me one time in the last 50 years when an American government program or agency grew
American
and it got...
government program agency?
Yes, because we're talking about
but we
America.
live in a capitalist structure.
Can you
where
give me
people
one
like
piece of
yourself
evidence
understand
where an
that-
American government program grew and it got more efficient and it did a better job at delivering value to the citizens? One.
He makes this as if it's a gotcha points, but I would note that most people probably don't know much about the history of specific government programs and how exactly their performance has changed over time, in comparison to their funding levels. So while many people might not be able to think of a good answer to this question on the spot, that doesn't mean that there aren't any good answers. Hasan's answer to his challenge was Medicare, which I think was a pretty good one. And here's the thing about many government programs. You don't notice when they're working well. When you go to the grocery store and buy food that's not saturated with all kinds of harmful chemicals, you don't think anything of it. You don't think to give credit to the government agencies that are responsible for holding companies accountable in these areas. You just think this is the way things are. If you've been sufficiently brainwashed by Fox News propaganda, you might even thank the free market for your food not being mixed with a healthy portion of fecal matter. Or I suppose I should say an unhealthy portion of fecal matter. I don't think there is such a thing as a healthy portion. Try some delicious fecal matter today. It builds strong, healthy bones. Hey, I get all the fecal matter I need from reading the Daily Wire. When you go for a swim in the lake or the river, you take for granted that you're not going to be swimming in putrid, toxic water. You don't take into consideration that the conditions of the waterway are the product of strict environmental regulation and government-mandated cleanup efforts. I would love to see your attempted free market solution to cleaning up a horribly polluted river. For those who recall, the Dave Rubin libertarian solution, as he outlined on the Joe Rogan Experience, was basically to share your outrage on social media when they start dumping in the river. To answer Charlie Kirk's challenge directly, there are several government programs that have done a better job as their funding and size has increased. In an article entitled The Forgotten Achievements of Government, Douglas J. Amy provides several examples. One successful program is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Quote, in 1970, the year before the creation of OSHA, 22 million people were injured on the job, and 14,000 died from job-related injuries. Since then, OSHA has helped to cut occupational injury and illness rates by 40%. Even more important, between 1980 and 2002, workplace deaths fell from 7.5 per 100,000 workers to 4.0. End quote. Pfft. Sounds to me like OSHA is just getting in the way of my freedom to have my arm chopped off by dangerous and poorly maintained equipment. Other successful examples are the National Institutes for Health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Quote, a variety of programs run by the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and state and local public health departments have greatly improved the health of most Americans. For example, the scourges of polio, cholera, and smallpox have been effectively eradicated from this country, a huge achievement. And vaccination programs have reduced by 95% our risks of contracting potentially debilitating diseases like hepatitis B, measles, mumps, tetanus, rubella, and diphtheria. Federal funds spent on buying and distributing these vaccines have saved countless lives. End quote. Another successful government program, at least before Scott Pruitt and his cronies started handcuffing it, is the Environmental Protection Agency. Here is just a small sampling of some of the EPA's greatest accomplishments, taken from their website. Quote, 1973, EPA begins the ban that will phase out all use of lead in gasoline, resulting in a 98% reduction in lead levels in the air. This phase-out protects millions of children from serious, permanent learning disabilities by helping to reduce blood lead levels by 75%. 1978. EPA and other federal agencies ban the use of chlorofluorocarbons as a propellant in most aerosol cans. CFCs destroy the Earth's ozone layer, which protects life on Earth from the harmful ultraviolet rays of the sun. 1980. EPA develops a nationwide program for toxic waste site cleanups under the new Superfund law. 1994. EPA announces a new set of pollution control standards to reduce by 90% the toxic air pollutants from chemical plants by 1997. End quote. Protecting our ozone layer from being completely destroyed sounds to me like a clear example of government overreach. What is this, George Orwell's 1984? I'm sure you could find examples of things that these agencies did wrong. Areas where they could have done better, examples of wasteful projects. But at the end of the day, these programs have been a net benefit to society. If we sharply reduce the funding to these government programs, obviously that would make it much more difficult to do their jobs, and that means that they would accomplish less. That means more toxic chemicals in the environment, more fecal bacteria mixed in with your food, and more preventable on-the-job accidents, just to give a few examples. Increasing funding to government programs like this, within reasonable limits of course, makes the world and our country a better place. Kirk also appeared to just completely fabricate statistics at various points in the debate. For example, he claims the following about Cuba.
Called evidence,
this works
Hasan.
in every other country that has tried to do this. This works. The system absolutely
Cuba?
works.
How does the Cuban healthcare system work?
The Cuban healthcare
system.
The Cuban healthcare system? Oh, you mean the country where they're on the verge of solving AIDS and a multitude of different cancer research? Like, what are you talking about?
Where their life expectancy is 15 years,
okay,
less than the United States, where they have widespread starvation, where they lock up political dissidents.
A quick Google search reveals that average life expectancy in Cuba is 80 years, compared to 79 years in the United States. So rather than their life expectancy being 15 years less than ours, it's actually 1 year more. At another point in the debate, he appears to just make up another statistic.
Versus socialism.
Even though 85% of all jobs in this country are created by small businesses.
Smallbusiness.com writes that, quote, 62% of all private sector jobs created since the Great Recession were created by small businesses, end quote. In the U.S. Small Business Administration reports that 49% of private sector employment comes from small businesses. The U.S. Small Business Administration sounds like a pretty goddamn reliable source when it comes to small businesses. Where is Charlie Kirk getting his non-facts from on these points? The U.S. slightly less Small Business Administration? Now, I don't even have a dog in this fight on either question. I don't have anything to gain or lose by him being right or wrong on these points. Just get your fucking facts right, man. At another point in the debate, Kirk made the argument that because you don't trust our currently corrupt governments, it doesn't make sense to make it bigger.
So here's something, Hasan, just so the audience can distill this. I don't trust the government, therefore, why make the government bigger? Hasan says he doesn't trust the government, and he wants to make government bigger. He says, the government is... This is Hasan. The government is largely bought by lobby...
Are you literally doing this is Hasan right now? Do you think you sound intelligent?
Can I summarize what you're saying?
Okay, go ahead.
We agreed that lobbyists have too much access to this government. You want to make that government bigger, stronger, more powerful. I want to make that government smaller, more accountable to the citizens. That's a huge difference between conservatives and progressives.
I love that, look, are we going to have an actual intelligent conversation surrounding this? Because more government doesn't necessarily always mean more bad government. It's not like I'm advocating for corruption here. Actually, as a matter of fact, if you want to talk about corruption, let's talk about lobbying. Let's talk about how money is speech, like how we fund politicians. Let's talk about the fact that politicians spend 70% of their time raising funds for their next campaign. I don't like that system. I advocate against it.
This is the exact same moronic point that Dave Rubin made when he embarrassed himself in his interview on the David Pakman Show. I don't know if they're getting their crappy information from the same source or what, but you'll have to ask Dave the Snowflake Rubin yourself, because this free speech crusader blocked me on Twitter for criticizing him. What a huge win in the battle of ideas. Now, I'm no refined classical liberal here, so pardon my ignorance, but how can a person even have a battle of ideas if they're inside of a safe space? So the argument is that calling for bigger government doesn't make sense if you believe that the government is corrupt. Here's the thing though, people on the left aren't just calling for a bigger government, they're also calling for us to purge the corruption from the system. The most left-wing politicians and political commentators in America are also the people who are most loudly calling for us to change our campaign finance system. Kirk frames it as if all they want to do is increase government while leaving the system as openly corruptible as it currently is. But these very people also favor policies that will get rid of this political corruption. And this isn't something that's buried in some footnote on page 170 of their books, but their anti-corruption viewpoints are at the forefront of their political ideologies. There is not a single topic that a politician like Bernie Sanders talks more about, and even the most casual observer of politics would know this. So how can a political junkie like Charlie Kirk make this argument with a straight face, and act as if he doesn't know what's wrong with it? Kirk says, quote, "We agree that lobbyists have too much access to this government," end quote. Great, so why not do what people on the left are calling for and reduce their access to government then? Is this really your approach? To just pathetically throw your hands up and accept defeat? To just concede that our government will forever be corrupt and not do anything to try to change these circumstances? Come on, Charlie, I thought you were the fighter here. I thought you were the guy with principle and backbone. I mean, Christ, you were about ready to start swinging on Cenk Uygur there at the end of the debate. But when it comes to the institution of government itself, you're that eager to throw in the towel and just give up? It's like saying, well, I would love to air condition my apartment, but the thing is broken, so it looks like I'm just gonna have to move to a cooler climate. What? No, how about you just fix the damn thing and your problem is solved? There's another exchange in the debate where Hasan points to the Nordic countries as examples where business can coexist with social safety nets in a way that leads to a thriving society. Charlie Kirk ultimately responds by throwing us a brilliant curveball. I'm kidding, he brings up Venezuela, as if anybody points to that country as a role model for us.
It's very nice of you to immediately launch this accusation that I don't care for small businesses, or small businesses will never exist under a social democracy, kind of similar to small businesses in Nordic countries and with robust economies, but with also a powerful and protective social welfare programs and socialized safety nets. This exists everywhere around the world. All of the comparable Western democratic nations have been able to institute socialist principles, and that's precisely why their people are a lot happier.
Norway, Sweden, and Finland, according to the World Economic Freedom Index, are ranked higher than the United States of America. That is not socialist. They have less tax. They have lower taxes.
So that means that you can have socialism and yet still have successful businesses in your country. Thank you for proving my point for me.
No,
I love this.
It's the exact opposite. You know what socialist is? Bernie Sanders wants an 80% tax rate on the rich.
Venezuela too, right? Dude, listen.
Bernie Sanders wants to keep our fossil fuel assets in the road.
You want me to explain it to you? Because you obviously don't understand it. Do you want me to explain it to you?
Is Cuba not socialist? Is North Korea not socialist? Was Vietnam not socialist? Was Zimbabwe not socialist? You can laugh all you want, Hasan,
okay,
but 100 million people died under socialism in the last 100 years, and you have the gumption to continue. You can keep laughing to the victims' families from Cuba, from Venezuela, from Korea, from Vietnam, from Mao's China, from Stalin's Russia. The number one killer of citizens, from innocent civilians in the last 100 years, has been the very idea that you shamelessly wear on your sleeve every single day. Marxism has killed more people than any other ideology over the last 100 years.
Okay.
Bringing up these oppressive regimes is page 1 of the 2018 Republican Playbook. I genuinely am starting to believe that whenever a person registers as a Republican, they get a little card in the mail to put in their wallet that says, "When in doubt, Venezuela." This is like their go-to point, and they actually think it's a good one. I'm actually considering moving to Venezuela just so I don't have to hear this shitty argument anymore. Notice the progression of this exchange here. Hasan starts out by pointing to the Nordic countries as examples of a good blend of socialism and capitalism, where business can coexist with a strong welfare state. He's like, hey, look at how good things are in Norway and Denmark and Sweden. What does Charlie Kirk do? Instead of having a conversation about how the Nordic model compares to the United States, he's like, some of these policies are socialist. What are the worst regimes I can think of that are associated with that term? We could just as easily use the same illogical tactic with Charlie. Imagine that he gives an example of a great business that provides real value to the world. I respond by saying, yeah, you know what else was a business? Enron. And then I just smugly stand there as if I've made a good point. Or I could even take a page out of Charlie's book and engage in a scathing diatribe against that company, and sanctimoniously grieve about how much suffering they've caused to so many thousands of Americans. Needless to say, when Charlie talks about the ideal business model, he probably doesn't have in mind characteristics like engaging in deliberate fraud, lying to your customers, and so forth. And it would be foolish of me to equate business with the worst examples of business. Why can't Charlie apply the same principle of charity to his political opponents? When we talk about our ideal political system, clearly we don't have in mind as our utopia oppressive regimes like North Korea or Stalinist Russia. Hey, I think it would be a good idea if we provided healthcare to our citizens. Oh yeah, sounds like something Joseph Stalin would say, right before he tortures you to death. I can't believe that anybody plays this game in a serious political conversation, and I can't believe anybody in the audience falls for this crude sleight of hand. Charlie might have a point if people on the left that he was debating came right out and said, we should seek to emulate the systems of Venezuela, North Korea, and Stalinist Russia. If that's what they were saying, yeah, go ahead and condemn these regimes. But clearly that's not what they're doing, because they give you precise examples of exactly the countries that they think we should be emulating. Countries like Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. So Charlie Kirk is attacking a straw man when he thunderously denounces these oppressive regimes, as if that takes any courage or intelligence to do. Because from what I can tell, none of his political opponents give those countries as examples that we should imitate. In fact, every single one of them points out the painfully obvious fact that those systems were complete nightmares. Wanting universal healthcare and publicly financed college education doesn't mean that we also want the sadistic North Korean prison camps, and the two obviously don't go hand in hand, as many countries around the world make absolutely clear. So as we can see, Charlie Kirk got a lot wrong in his recent debate against Hasan Piker, and what we explored here was just the tip of the iceberg. He claims that impoverished, crime-riddled cities demonstrate the folly of democratic policies, yet he ignores the fact that the majority of the best-run cities are also democratic. He implies that no government program provides value commensurate with its growing budget, and this is just demonstrably false, as OSHA, the EPA, and the CDC demonstrate. Charlie made overtly false claims about Cuban life expectancy and small businesses. He made the absurd argument that calling for more government programs doesn't make sense considering the existence of political corruption, an argument that doesn't acknowledge efforts on the left to eliminate this corruption. Finally, he brings up the boogeyman of Venezuela and a smattering of history's most oppressive regimes, in response to the simple point that the Nordic model is one that does well. Charlie Kirk may have come to this debate with a lot of statistics and talking points memorized and ready to be spewed out at a rapid-fire pace, but when you take a look at the actual quality of his arguments, you find that sounding like you know what you're talking about isn't the same as actually knowing what you're talking about. Like everybody and their grandma these days on YouTube, I have a Patreon page that you can use to financially support my efforts on this channel. If you find my content informative and entertaining, head on over to patreon.com/theskepticalhuman to financially thank me. Thank you all for watching and listening, as always, and until next time, take care.